Today marks the end of an incredibly fun journey as one of my top favorite manga over the past 10 years, Eden Zero, has officially ended with chapter 293. I always get a little depressed when I get to this part of a manga's life cycle, especially when it comes to a weekly manga, because checking the updates for this manga week by week has been such a big part of my life over the past few years that I know by this time next week, when I'm expecting a new chapter to drop, I'm going to look at my phone and my heart's going to break just a tiny bit when I realize that the series will no longer be updated going forward. I mean, sure, we might get a point 0.5 chapter later on when the final volume drops if Hero decides to make one, and it's most likely just going to be an epilogue that shows us a few years down the road after the ending of the series and shows us exactly what's going on with our main cast. But other than that, chapter 293 was officially the ending of the entire story. And I gotta say, as far as conclusions to a story goes, while I know this has been a somewhat divisive final saga amongst the fans, to me personally, I feel like this was the mostly satisfying conclusion to the overall story. And what really sells this final chapter as being satisfying to me is the conclusion to Pino's overall story. Because ever since her introduction into Eden Zero, her main driving goal has been the idea that one day, when she reaches Mother and gets her wish, she can be reborn as a human. And after a long, strenuous journey of trying to get to this point where she had to fight against her own creator and sacrifice herself in order to protect her friends and family, she finally got the chance to achieve her wish. You see, years later, although they don't exactly specify how many years have passed between chapters 292 and 293, but sometime in the near future, we see that everyone amongst the Eden Zero crew has grown older and gone their separate ways for the most part, although seemingly they do still keep in touch, and they're all gathering together once again in this final chapter to celebrate the birth of Rebecca and Shiki's child. Which, by the way, it was nice to see confirmation in this chapter of the two leads from the series finally getting together and becoming an item, especially after years and two separate series of the same thing being wished upon the two main leads in Fairy Tail, and still no official word on whether or not that's actually going to end up happening. Despite the fact that we've already seen the alternate universe version of those two characters together with a kid, Hero still hasn't given us exactly what we've been asking for since basically the beginning of the story. But hey, at least he gave it to us here in the finale of Eden Zero, although it was kind of disappointing that throughout the entire chapter, the only thing we really see of Rebecca is her grunting and groaning over trying to give birth to her child, and the only thing we actually get dialogue-wise from her throughout the entire chapter is a short grunt of agreement to Shiki when it comes to them deciding exactly what the name of their daughter will be. And surprising absolutely no one, they do decide to name their daughter Pino after their beloved family member who had sacrificed herself in order to make sure that they can actually have the future that they have now. But this is actually where Hero throws a big twist that I personally did not see coming. You see, despite Mother literally handing her on a silver platter the one thing she has always wanted, Pino decides to turn it down, realizing that Shiki and Rebecca's daughter is her own person and meant to have her own life. And by accepting Mother's offer, she would take away that life from someone so young. So instead, she decides to request to be reborn or to have her soul return to her robot body so that she can live alongside her friends. Because at the end of the day, as the message has been clearly stated throughout the entirety of Eden Zero, it doesn't matter if you're human or android, you can be loved and feel love all the same. And that's why, to me, this final chapter, despite nothing really happening during the entirety of it, is such a great conclusion to the story because it continues to drive home one last time the message that has been the main driving factor, or at least to me, throughout the entirety of Eden Zero. Hero even doubles down on that message as we see when it comes to the rest of the crew being split off, that Wise and Hermit, the two that have basically been paired off together as a couple throughout the entire story, despite one being human and one being android, they are living together in the future, and we can assume that they are together. And we can safely assume this because Hero's basically set up the same kind of character path for their relationship that he did for both Gajeel and Levy over in Fairy Tail, where we never got 100% confirmation on screen during the main story that the two of them were an item until the final arc. And while we never got an official I love you from either Wise or Hermit throughout the entire story, we did get this one moment between the two of them that basically all but said it. So yeah, because Hero shows such great character growth for Pino in this final chapter and use it to push home the message of the overall story, to me, the ending to Eden Zero was very satisfying. Now, that being said, I know a big part of the fandom, or at the very least a very vocal part of it, wasn't exactly happy with the way Hero handled the final saga, because it seemed like there was a huge tonal shift once we got to Universe Zero, from a very dark and serious story to a more happy-go-lucky one, which I understand where they're coming from. Even for me, there were some parts of the story in the final saga that I didn't exactly agree with. Like personally, even though I know a lot of people were complaining about this, I think that the way Hero handled the opening to the Universe Zero saga was actually pretty smart. Basically speed blitzing through all the pre-time skip arcs and giving the heroes a chance to basically have a better outcome to them. And not only have a better outcome, but to turn former enemies into allies. It was a great way to show the difference between this universe and the previous ones and to establish this one as the main timeline. And not only that, it gave a reason for the Eden Zero crew to have backup in the final battle. And then that mini arc we got when we went to Rebecca's mother's home planet and got to deal with Joker, that was actually a lot of fun. But then once we got into the final battle against the Edens 1, that's when things started to sour even for me a little bit. And it was mostly due to the fact that I didn't like the way some of the final battles were handled. Mostly when it came to the newly introduced bad guys, I didn't really care when it came to Cure and Agnolia that we dealt with them so quickly just because of the fact that they were enemies that we had already dealt with and didn't really need to revisit that much. Same with most of the Dark Stars. I didn't really think we needed to revisit them. But when it came to the newer characters that were introduced, I felt like a little bit more time and effort could have been devoted to those fights to make them feel more impactful. Especially when it came to Laguna versus Lightning Jaw, because that was the debut of Laguna's Overdrive. But to me, those two fights were really the only low points of the entire saga. I think all the other fights were handled well, especially Ziggy versus the Edens 1. Finding out that the Edens 1 was Ziggy and future Rebecca's child was a huge reveal that I didn't see coming, even though it was right there in our face the entire time. But even if you were somehow disappointed by even that fight, I think we can all sit down and agree that the reveal of the Chronophage's true nature was a huge moment for the story. Like, don't get me wrong, the moment we saw the humanoid version of the Chronophage that Shiki ended up fighting, I knew that it was going to be revealed to be the essence, the persona, the memories, the soul, something related to the future Rebecca that got sent in the future in Ziggy's timeline. But even so, that was still such a brilliant twist that even up until the chapter had happened, I did not see anyone calling until we saw the character on panel. Overall, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I really enjoyed the story for Eden Zero from beginning to end, and going forward, I'm going to miss it. I mean, like I already mentioned before, checking the weekly updates for this story has been such a big part of my life over the past few years that I know when it comes time for the new chapter update in my head next week, that once I realize that there's no updates going forward, I'm going to be a bit depressed. But the fact that immediately after reading the final chapter, I already began missing the series, that just tells me exactly how much of an impact the story had on me. So because of that, I'm going to give the overall story for Eden Zero a solid 8.5 out of 10. Like I already mentioned, I'm going to miss it going forward. But at the same time, I'm glad it ended as well as it did, and I'm looking forward to seeing exactly what kind of story Hiro Mashima cooks up next.